Welcome, everybody, and happy Valentine's Day. I'm so delighted that you could join us for today's MTI Research Snaps webinar, the Central Valley Transportation Challenge. This is the second in our Advancing Transportation Equity series, which explores transforming equity as we reflect on some of the most pressing issues of diversity and accessibility in the transportation industry. I'm Dr. Karen Philbrick. I'm the Executive Director of the Mineta Transportation Institute at San Jose State University. MTI leads 3 competitively selected multi-university consortia. The first is the Mineta Consortium for Transportation Mobility, funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. We also lead the California State University Transportation Consortium, funded by the California Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017. And finally, we lead the Climate Change and Extreme Events Training and Research Program, funded by the Federal Railroad Administration. All of our work focuses on improving the mobility of people and goods, and we do this by improving the safety, efficiency, accessibility, and convenience of our nation's transportation system. As you'll learn from today's webinar, students from minority populations and those particularly in rural communities often do not have the same opportunities as their peers from majority groups. The Central Valley Transportation Challenge, herein referred to as the Challenge, is a project-based learning program that brings university faculty and students to K-12 classrooms in rural areas. It provides underserved minority groups with high-quality educational experiences that introduce them to transportation contact and future careers within this industry. Today, we'll learn how this particular challenge empowered students and how this model can be used to make a positive impact in the transportation industry as a whole and across the nation. Our speaker today is Dr. Christian Vanderler. I'm trying really hard. I think I almost got that right. He's an associate professor of research methods and statistics at California State University, Fresno. Fresno State is one of MTI's partners in the California State University Transportation Consortium. Christian has a PhD in personality and positive psychology from the University of Zurich. He's currently researching the use of agile learning methods and design thinking in action civic projects. And I think Christian's background perfectly demonstrates that there's a place for everybody within the transportation sector. It's not just reserved for engineers or urban planners. During the webinar, if you have questions, please feel free to drop those into chat or into the Q&A feature. We're recording this webinar, and later today, a link will be made available along with the slides for your later use. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, Christian. I yield the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. Thank you, Alvarina. It's a pleasure to be here, and welcome to all the participants and everyone that's watching this recording. The goal today is to really give you a little bit more insights on the transportation challenge and what we did, and hopefully we'll also give you some inspirations of how you might be involved in transportation education in the future. Be it through your expertise in transportation industry, or maybe if we have teachers joining us to be inspired and see how they can leverage this wonderful topic in their own instruction. And yes, let's get started with the first slides. Here you see some impressions. And first of all, what was really the goal of the challenge, right? The goal is to reach rural students, and typically the rural students are also underserved minority students, right? We looked at the whole spectrum between Bakersfield and Stockton, right? That was the area that we targeted. And we really wanted to see how can we reach out to students that are typically not as easily reached and typically don't have as many opportunities as students in the urban areas. So the goal was, on one hand, to educate students about transportation-related topics, but also really highlight the career opportunities that come with it, right? So that's, and I see Bobby Lou raised his hand already. Maybe, Bobby, if you put the question in the chat. And yes, okay. Okay, here you see a little overview of the different stakeholders, right? So first of all, the participants, well, who are participants? And we primarily serve the students in K through 12, right? But we also have the university people, and those are university students that we get involved, and then also university faculty. Furthermore, we try to always collaborate with community members, be it the parents, be it local nonprofits, or also industry leaders, right? So we try to connect the students and the teachers directly also with people from the industry, depending on what topic they work on. And yeah, if we go on to the next slide, please. So I want to first of all also acknowledge our students here from the Fresno State, and those were mainly engineering students. Right? We had Arun Salamani, Utsav Shah, Subtahib Sarkar, and David Ryman, and they were all part of a class that was facilitated by the Fresno State Transportation Institute, and that's how I recruited them to come and help me in this project. And the way that they worked is that during the challenge, they were coaching individual student groups, right? And really helped also inspire the students. Not just on the content, but also the fact that, you know, they're university students, they're engineering students, right? They were really able to model what it means to go into this career path. Okay. And what's really beautiful about the challenge is that the topics are flexible, right? So here we chose the topic of how do we make biking to school safer? And one thing that's really important also to remember is at this point in time, we were in the middle of the COVID pandemic, right? So a lot of the things that we initially wanted to do were a little bit more challenged, right? So when we first designed the challenge, we were assuming, we already planned it to be remote, right? Just because of the reaching students in further areas, in rural areas. But what happened is, while we initially planned to have all the students with their teacher in a classroom, and then we would just kind of zoom in or use Teams to you know, interact with them, now we also had all the students at home, right? Which made it a little bit more complex, but we'll show you how we handle this situation. Okay, here is a sample schedule for the challenge. And if you look at the different sessions, we typically do it for 8 sessions, but that could be beefed up a little bit if teachers have more time, or it could also be reduced if you have less time available. And I want to give you a quick overview here, and then we'll dive into each session, right? So this is a sample session with Gloria, and this was actually a group of 3rd and 4th graders, okay? Typically, the way we start is with the session 1, we talk about transportation. What does that even mean, right? And typically, you talk about different modes of transportation. So what you see here is just brainstorming and students kind of getting more familiar with this idea of transportation and what different modes to actually know. Then in the second session, we start categorizing this a bit more, right? So, right, we have them bring in examples of different transportation, and then they have to decide how do we group these, right? So you could probably see different ways of categorizing this, right? You kind of see how the students chose to do that. And then in session 3, right, from a more general aspect of transportation, right, we discussed, hey, how do you get to school, right? And this was a rural school. As you can see, it's a little bit of a suburban environment in the end, but then it's mostly rural. So the On the left, on the right side, you see where the school is at. So it's surrounded by different fields, right? And we asked students, well, can you walk to school? Typically, they said it's too far away, right? And then could you ride your bike to school, right? And this is also a way of challenging their typical perception of what's doable, what's feasible, what's not feasible, right? So in this particular instance, we see that it would take from this particular student, right? We had each student had to figure out how far away am I from the school, right? And we can then discuss averages, right? Average travel time to school, average distance to school, right? And then what we also did is, okay, what modes of transportation do you actually have available to you, right? And here in this instance, for example, there actually is a city bus that goes by the school, right? So they could potentially take that bus, or they could take private transportation like a car, right? Or what we then also started discussing is biking and walking. And by the way, right, for the teachers that are here, Google Maps is a great tool to do this. It typically gives you all kinds of estimated travel times. So it's really easy for students to use that. And just to kind of orient themselves and see where are we at, how far away are others from the school, and explore that a little bit more. So all kinds of connections to geography, map reading, math, right, to calculate different things. So now we're really in a project-based learning environment where it all makes sense to them, right? It's all in a context that fits into an overall picture. So let's move on to the fourth session, because now we're kind of guiding them towards biking, right? So we had that in mind, but we go with where the interest of the students are as well, right? And now we discuss about advantages and disadvantages of biking to school, right? So why should you do that, or why should you not do that? And if you look at the disadvantages, right, you could see that safety is a concern, right? You could fall off the bike, right? Or you could get lost, right? Or you could get injured, right? So there's all kinds of concerns about this, right? But on the other hand, in green, you also see that the students, they see a lot of positives, right? You can get fresh air, you don't waste gas, right? You don't pollute the air, etc. So there's a lot of pluses and minuses that are being discussed and highlighted.
And Christian, I like the way that you have verbatim quotes here, like, you do not need a license, spelled LISINS, for the third and fourth graders. That's really cute. That's precious.
Yeah. So this is and this is really co-created with the students, right? We type it, and so we did numerous iterations of this, right? Once we kind of come up with the different sessions, we guide them through these activities, and depending on which group you're part of, that particular slide will look a bit differently, right? And then there's some things that we want to highlight. So if the students don't bring it up, we might introduce it, right? So for example, air pollution, right? Or safety aspect, or also the health benefits for you as a student. So let's go on to the session 5, right? So at this point in time, hopefully the students would think that biking to school actually could be a really good idea. However, what does our transportation infrastructure look like, right? So what we do first is we share with them some examples of bike safety, right? Some really positive examples, and here is where the university students really come in, right? So typically they are the ones facilitating this, right? Because they're the transportation experts, and they really teach the kids, hey, look, here's what this could look like. Sometimes they also involve them to search pictures online, right, to really find these positive examples, because unfortunately, they typically don't see that directly in their environment. Right? And then in the next session, what we do is we leverage, now that they know what safe biking looks like, we're doing a virtual bike audit, right? So what we did is we said to every kid, right, they find out where's their home, where is their school, right? And then we say, all right, let's walk through this through Google Maps and go step by step and decide where is it safe and where is it not safe. If you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, I don't have it in there, but basically they walk through it and they decide, okay, how many times is it safe? How many times is it not safe, right? They categorize that. We have them call this in. And then where we really focus on is the access and surroundings to the school, right? So they create an overview, hey, what are safe zones and what are not so safe zones? So you can see here, right, this rural school, there is a lot of unsafe areas for them. And so that's the first step here, right? And then we go into the project for the students to say, hey, now, knowing what you know now, how would you redesign this school? How could we make it safer? And they develop a prototype of a safer design. And then they share that with each other and learn from each other how they could make the school bike friendlier and safer to bike to. And if you could go, please go on to, yeah. And so when we collect those ideas, right, we have a brainstorm. We'll say, okay, what are things that are good about riding to school? What would make it safer? And then what are some of the challenges that you have right now, right? So that's also really giving them a little bit more context as well. And then ultimately, they propose the changes for the school, right? So you see here in this instance, there are the bike lanes that they introduced. There's also bike parking, right? There's all kinds of the changes that the students propose. And typically, ideally now, right, we would have the school actually look at this as well and say, hey, what can we do to really facilitate a safer biking environment? So this is an example of this challenge that we did with the 3rd and 4th graders. Now, I just want to show you some other highlights. So this was a similar challenge. This time around, the students focused on creating a safer pickup zone for their school, right? So they went, they went with the status quo, right? Where the reality is people are going to drop kids off with their cars. So how do we make that safer, right? So we had them create 3D models and really collaborate together and designing a school that's safer, that's maybe a better traffic flow to drop kids off and pick them up. And then the next one was about prototypes, how to bring students to school safer, right? So this was really a cool example because some of the students were in class and were developing these prototypes there. So the student on the very left, he designed a flying object to transport kids to school, right? Whereas the student in the middle and the student on the right, they were studying from home, right? So they developed their prototypes, and the middle student here, he developed some kind of a safety mold with kind of a foam. So he showed that he was baking that in the oven. So he did a little chemistry experiment at home, so showing the results there with the impressions. And the other student on the very right designed a vehicle, a safe vehicle with solar panels on the top and very safe to bring students to school. So these are some other ways to engage the students, right? And really to bring their learning to life and show how they solve the challenges that we present to them. And I think I have like one more slide, but then we can segue into the Q&A.
Excellent. One last slide.
So this is what I'm really excited about too. And this is also a work that's in continuous development here. But we have an online hub for lessons for teachers. So it's all transportation related. And let's say, for example, here is the walking to school challenge, right? So if you were interested in doing this with your students, you can access this and you have all kinds of materials and more detailed explanations and lesson plans on how could you do this with your students. And then we also have very specific lessons about certain topics. And we're actually just this spring, we're going to work on expanding this more, where for our idea right now is, for example, if we always struggle with fitting more in, right? Teachers are busy, they have a lot going on. So what we said is, hey, what if you need a sub, right? And instead of having to worry about developing a lesson plan for the sub, what if you could just grab one of these high quality lessons about transportation and then give that to the students? And our goal is actually to develop a lesson that is a self-guided lesson, right? Where students, that it's so clear that students can engage with it, leverage technology, and spend some time on being involved in transportation, kind of whet their appetite to learn more about this fascinating field, and also be aware of all the career opportunities that they have.
Absolutely. And Dr. Christian, your last statement is so spot on, because we are in a crisis when it comes to building the transportation pipeline of talented individuals to take over in the future, experiencing a massive shortage all the way from the front lines to the C-suite, really demonstrating that there's a place for everybody, whether or not that's a mechanic or somebody that pursues a 4-year or advanced degree beyond that. But back to your transportation hub, when you talk about these lessons and them being appropriate for K through 12, I know you spent some time talking about the 3rd and 4th graders, but what was the process that you used in order to ensure that everything was age appropriate and relatable without being too young or too old for some of the groups?
So we align this to the California standards, right?
The curriculum standards?
Curriculum standards. And then we also leverage the expertise of the teachers, right? So we would meet with the teachers that are familiar with that particular group of students, right? We kind of share, hey, here is the ideas, here's some of the technologies we use, right? And then we would get their feedback about, how competent are they in using certain technology, right? We use a lot of the Google suite, so Google Slides, Jamboard, things like that. But depending on what it is, we can always adjust, right? So we really rely on the feedback of the teachers, because they really know, first of all, we approach them with the standards in mind, but then they know their particular students and the individuals that they work with at that time.
So in some ways, you pilot tested the curriculum, and in aligning it with the California Common Core requirements, ensured that this is a lesson plan that could be easily dropped in for a substitute or for another teacher. What I hear that means is that you're not adding to the burden of all of the topics they need to teach, but rather adapting the transportation content to fit their requirements.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And we had developed some charts as well for them, hey, which lesson, which standards are you going to hit with this lesson, right? So it's really typically just highlighting a little bit more about, hey, here is exactly what you're teaching and how this relates to the curriculum that you're covering anyways, right? And I think that's really important, not just for the individual teacher, but sometimes also for administrators to just understand, hey, why should maybe we as a school participate in this, that they see how this fits into their overall picture.
Absolutely. And you talked earlier about kind of some of the learning loss and the other challenges we experienced during the pandemic. So the easier you make it for teachers to adapt, the more successful you'll be. And that brings me to a question that was submitted earlier with the registration. And that is, this program created that online transportation hub with a lesson repository. What's been the most popular lessons for teachers to use, and what's been the impact on students?
So that's a good question. I would have to go back and check them. I think very popular lessons are around sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
And then what I noticed, just from the direct work with the students, like anything related to drones and autonomous cars, like electric field, students typically like that type of stuff.
That's pretty exciting stuff. I know in some of our K through 12 programs, we get an overwhelming response to that, but also to the high-speed rail project, which brings me to another question. You're right in Fresno. You talked about Bakersfield. You're right in that catchment area for the new high-speed rail construction that's happening. And I understand that hot off the presses today, that project has now engaged over 10,000 individuals in good income-producing activities with benefits. How was rail introduced or talked about with this age group?
So what we did is at one point we had some visitors that also shared about the high-speed rail, right? We didn't particularly focus on it, but we kept bringing it up to them and also say, hey, when you drive on the 99, you notice the construction sites, right? So that they put two and two together that, hey, this is there's stuff happening here. And this summer, actually, we're going to have a summer camp with the Fresno State Transportation Institute. And we'll also have field trips to go visit some of the sites where there are the construction sites, where the students can learn directly on, what's going on and what the future is going to bring here with the high-speed rail.
Which I think is so incredibly exciting, because for people who reside outside of California in large part, and some who reside in California, because of the media, might believe that this project is dead, but I assure you it is alive and well, with viaducts that you can tour and 119 miles under construction, creating jobs and addressing kind of that challenge of employment that was experienced in the Central Valley prior to the pandemic. In fact, before this project came online, unemployment topped 25%, and now it's been in the single digits. So we're seeing that real-time project-based learning addressing a skilled shortage and bringing good employment opportunities to those who may not have had that experience. Got an interesting question for you here. The districts you work with have a substantial percentage of underserved minority students, and 3 districts have between 14 and almost 26% of English language learners. How did you ensure that the lessons were accessible and useful to all students, including those who may have language barrier or learning English as a second language?
Yes, so that's a great question. We use a lot of visuals, right? So when we talk about different modes of transport, we use a lot of visuals. The particular students that we work with were all English proficient, right? So we didn't have to work with translators, but I think that will be one of the things to really make sure that we involve them, is to make sure that the students actually understand what we're talking about. So we didn't have any particular accommodations for the English language learners, but I think our approach to the project-based learning is really it's much more student-centered. So it's not a whole lot of us talking at them; it's really working with them, and they're also working with each other.
And I bet you could see the enthusiasm increase over the experience of working together and these kids being introduced to new concepts.
Oh yeah, it was exciting, and I think also our university students were doing such a great job. So the students really look forward to that. And during the pandemic, what was great is we would typically work in smaller groups and breakout rooms, right? So they would look forward to us basically visiting them in the classroom, right? But it's all very fluid and virtual, but it made it a lot easier to for not just our university students, right, but also for the teachers. And typically we'd meet beforehand, right? We'd have a little session to prepare with the teachers, with university students, and then we'd have they also had a good infrastructure, the different teams that we worked with, where we didn't really have university students alone with students, right? We had typically other teachers or teacher aides that were assisting them as well. So that made it, from a logistical perspective, made it really, really good. And, it helped with on one hand, bringing that expertise from the content, but also have that pedagogical expertise and knowledge of the students right there.
Absolutely. And really demonstrating how exciting this is for our university students and our K through 12 students. I'm sorry to say that with that, our time with you today has come to a close, but thank you so much for sharing your expertise and the lessons and the repository that people can access to learn more. And thank you to all of you joining us today. Don't forget about our next transportation equity webinar, which will be held next week, February 21st. It will be the third in the series, and it will look at free transit. It all depends on how. So thank you again for joining us today, and I wish you all a wonderful Valentine's Day.